Nobody raised their voice, nobody slammed a door, and yet, in one quiet moment, everything about the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation was exposed. It didn't come from a headline-grabbing rant or some emotional meltdown on the podium. It came from a veteran coach choosing his words carefully and choosing his silence even more carefully. Because sometimes what isn't said tells you far more than what is. When Bobby Musgrave spoke about rookie quarterback Shedeur Sanders, the tone in the room shifted. Not because he was dramatic, but because he was precise, calm, deliberate. Every sentence felt measured, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And if you were paying attention, you could feel it. Something inside that building wasn't aligned. On the surface, it sounded like a simple discussion about rookie growing pains, normal stuff, mistakes, adjustments, development, but underneath that calm delivery was a message that hit a lot harder. A message about how Sanders had been handled, about opportunities denied, about decisions that may have already cost the Browns more than they want to admit. Because this wasn't just about a young quarterback struggling early, this was about a system that seemed more interested in protecting its image than developing its talent. A rookie with clear upside buried on the depth chart, while the organization quietly pushed a narrative that he just wasn't ready. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Musgrave didn't attack anyone by name. He didn't need to. The way he framed Sanders' situation, the patience he demanded, the context he provided, the examples he used, all pointed in one direction, toward a philosophy that punishes imperfection instead of teaching through it. That's when it became clear this wasn't just a coaching comment, it was a line in the sand, a subtle but unmistakable challenge to how the Browns are developing their most important position. Because when a quarterback coach feels the need to speak this carefully, this publicly, something has already gone wrong behind the scenes, and what came next would only make that tension impossible to ignore. The moment didn't feel explosive at first. No dramatic headline, no viral soundbite meant to light up social media. But for anyone who's watched this league long enough, it was obvious something had changed the second Bobby Musgrave started talking. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't emotional, he sounded like someone who had reached a breaking point quietly. When he addressed Shedeur Sanders' early struggles, he didn't frame them as failures, he framed them as checkpoints, necessary steps, the kind every rookie quarterback goes through whether teams want to admit it or not. And that alone set his comments apart from the messaging fans had been hearing all season. Musgrave went out of his way to normalize Sanders' mistakes. Pocket drifting, hesitation, reads that came a split second late. Instead of calling them problems, he treated them like evidence of a young quarterback learning in real time. That distinction mattered because it directly clashed with the idea that those same habits justified keeping Sanders buried on the depth chart. And then came the silence. As Musgrave spoke, he praised the people who helped Sanders grow. He highlighted the system that eventually gave him a chance. He acknowledged the reps, the preparation, the structure that finally allowed the game to slow down. But there was one voice missing from that story, one name that never came up. And in the NFL, that kind of omission is never accidental. You don't forget to mention the head coach, not in a setting like that, not when every word is being dissected. When a veteran coach chooses who to credit and who to leave out, he's making a statement without ever raising it to a confrontation, and that's exactly what Musgrave did. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Sanders anymore. It was about alignment, or the lack of it, about whether the people tasked with developing a quarterback were even on the same page. Because the more Musgrave talked, the clearer it became that someone inside the building saw Sanders as a growing asset, while someone else saw him as a risk best kept on the sideline. And once that realization set in, it was impossible to hear those comments as harmless. This wasn't coach speak. This was a calculated shift in the narrative, a moment where the internal story leaked into the open, quietly, deliberately, and with consequences that were only just beginning to surface. To understand why Musgrave's words hit so hard, you have to go back to the decision that started all of this, the one that quietly set the tone for Shedeur Sanders' entire rookie season. The Browns didn't ease him in. They didn't give him a developmental runway. They dropped him all the way to fourth string. Fourth string isn't just low on the depth chart, it's football purgatory. It's where quarterbacks go to hold a clipboard, run scout team reps, and stay out of sight. For a rookie with real upside, that placement sends a clear message, not just to the player, but to the locker room. You're not part of the plan right now. And that's what made the decision so jarring. This wasn't a case of Sanders being wildly unprepared or overwhelmed. Reports from inside the building suggested steady progress, strong work habits, and a quarterback who was absorbing everything thrown at him. Yet none of that translated into opportunity. Instead, the team doubled down on a preseason evaluation and treated it like a final verdict. Musgrave made it clear this wasn't about ability, it was about philosophy, a mindset that expects rookies to look polished before they're allowed to play, instead of understanding that polish comes from playing. That approach might protect coaches from short-term criticism, but it does nothing for long-term development. By locking Sanders into fourth-string status, the Browns effectively froze his growth. No real reps, no live-fire adjustments, just observation from the sideline while the season moved on without him. And once that decision was made, everything else followed. The narrative that he wasn't ready, the justification for keeping him buried, the slow drip of doubt planted in the public conversation. But the most damaging part wasn't what it did to Sanders' stat line. It was what it revealed about how the organization evaluates young quarterbacks. Because when a team decides that a few preseason habits outweigh months of progress, it's not development, it's dismissal. And that's the backdrop Musgrave was pushing against. Because while Sanders was stuck at the bottom of the depth chart, something else was happening behind the scenes. He wasn't stagnating, he was improving, and the people closest to his development could see it, even if the ones making the final calls chose not to. The justification always sounded reasonable on the surface. Sanders drifted in the pocket. His reads weren't always instant. Sometimes the ball came out a beat late. In August, those flaws were treated like warning signs instead of what they actually were, the standard growing pains of a rookie quarterback adjusting to the speed of the NFL. Bobby Musgrave wasn't buying that framing. When he spoke, he flipped the entire narrative on its head. Those weren't red flags to him, they were mile markers, proof that Sanders was processing, learning, and adapting, the kind of mistakes you expect before things start to click. But inside the Browns' decision-making chain, those same habits were used as leverage to justify keeping him on the sideline. That's where the philosophy clash became impossible to ignore. Instead of teaching through mistakes, the organization treated mistakes as disqualifiers. Instead of allowing Sanders to work through discomfort in live situations, they punished him for not being comfortable fast enough. And that's a dangerous way to handle a young quarterback. Musgrave even pulled out a name that carries real weight, John Elway, not as a flashy comparison or hype tactic, but as a reminder. Elway struggled early. So did countless quarterbacks who eventually became franchise cornerstones. Pocket movement issues, processing speed, timing. None of that meant they weren't capable. It meant they were at the beginning. But in Cleveland, those same issues were framed like evidence that Sanders didn't belong on the field yet. And once that narrative took hold, it became self-fulfilling. No reps meant no chance to correct those habits in real time. No trust meant no opportunity to prove growth where it actually matters. What made it worse was how selective the criticism felt. Every small misstep was magnified. Every positive rep was minimized. Sanders wasn't being evaluated on a curve meant for rookies. He was being judged like a finished product, and when he didn't meet that impossible standard, the doors stayed closed. Musgrave's message cut through all of that. Mistakes aren't the enemy. Avoiding them is, because quarterbacks don't learn by being hidden, they learn by being tested. And by treating rookie errors like weapons instead of teaching moments, the Browns didn't just slow Sanders down, they created the very problems they claimed they were trying to prevent. What made Musgrave's comments impossible to ignore wasn't just what he defended, but who he chose to highlight. When he talked about the moments where Shedeur Sanders finally looked comfortable, confident, and in control, he didn't speak in generalities. He gave credit, specific credit, and that choice mattered. Musgrave pointed directly to offensive coordinator Tommy Rees. He talked about the structure, the play designs, the way the system finally allowed Sanders to play fast instead of thinking fast. According to him, once Sanders was put in situations that matched his strengths, the progress became obvious. The game slowed down, the decisions sharpened, the confidence followed. That wasn't accidental praise. In the NFL, coaches are careful about where they direct credit because they know what it implies. By lifting up Rees, Musgrave was making it clear that when Sanders was actually given support, the results showed up immediately. Development wasn't some mystery waiting to be solved. It was already happening. And then there was the silence. Not once did Musgrave acknowledge the head coach. No mention of leadership, no nod to the overall vision, no shared responsibility. Just a clean omission that hung in the air. For anyone familiar with how these dynamics work, that silence landed like a message sent in bold letters. This wasn't forgetfulness, it was precision. Musgrave praised the people who helped Sanders grow and left out the person who had the authority to put him on the field sooner and chose not to. That contrast told you everything about where he believed the breakdown occurred. Suddenly, the conversation shifted from player readiness to organizational alignment, because when a quarterback coach publicly credits one side of the staff while ignoring the other, it signals a deeper divide. It suggests that Sanders' delay wasn't about development timelines, but about conflicting visions inside the building. And that's why this section of Musgrave's comments hits so hard. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. Praise used as a spotlight, silence used as a warning, and together they revealed a fracture the Browns could no longer pretend wasn't there. Once you connect the dots, a much bigger problem comes into focus. This wasn't just a disagreement about one player, it was a breakdown in how development even works inside the Browns building. Different coaches pulling in different directions, operating under completely different ideas of what progress is supposed to look like. On one side, you had coaches focused on growth, reps, teaching through mistakes, allowing a young quarterback to evolve naturally. On the other, a philosophy built around control, minimizing risk, avoiding early blemishes, and waiting for perfection before granting opportunity. Those two approaches can't coexist, and when they do, the player in the middle always pays the price. Sanders became the clearest example of that disconnect. While some coaches saw steady improvement behind the scenes, others treated the depth chart like a locked door. No matter how much progress was made, the decision had already been made, and instead of reevaluating, the system doubled down. That kind of environment doesn't just stall development, it fractures trust. A quarterback doesn't know who's actually in his corner. Teammates don't understand why improvement doesn't matter. Isn't being rewarded. Coaches end up working in silos, each trying to do their part while knowing the final call might never change. And this wasn't happening in isolation. Browns fans have seen this pattern before. Promising quarterbacks mishandled, growth timelines ignored, confidence chipped away by indecision and rigidity. Sanders' situation didn't feel like a one-off. It felt familiar, and that's what made it so alarming. Musgrave's comments pulled that tension into the open. Without accusing anyone outright, he exposed a system where development depended on who you answered to, not how well you were progressing. Where talent could be acknowledged privately and suppressed publicly. Where patience was preached but rarely practiced. At that point, this stopped being about wins and losses. It became about culture. About whether the Browns actually have a unified plan for developing quarterbacks, or whether they're still stuck in internal power struggles that quietly sabotage the very players they're supposed to build around. And then, the evidence finally showed up where it mattered most, on the field. Once Shedeur Sanders started getting real snaps, the excuses fell apart almost immediately. The game didn't look too fast for him. His feet were calmer, his timing was cleaner. The hesitation that critics latched onto early began to fade. Instead of drifting aimlessly, he moved with purpose. Instead of locking onto his first read, he worked through progressions and took what the defense gave him. These weren't flashes of luck, they were signs of preparation meeting opportunity. What stood out most was the poise. Sanders wasn't playing like someone overwhelmed by the moment. He looked like someone who had been waiting for it. Comfortable extending plays, confident stepping into throws, aware of pressure without panicking. All the traits that were supposedly missing showed up the moment he was allowed to operate within the offense. And that's the part that stung for the people who kept him sidelined. This growth didn't come from a sudden coaching epiphany or a last-minute fix. It was the result of weeks, even months of unseen work, reps behind the scenes, film study, grinding through limited opportunities while being told implicitly that it still wasn't enough. Every completed pass made the earlier decisions harder to defend, because with each outing, the question grew louder. If this is what Sanders looks like now, how far along could he have been if he'd gotten these reps earlier? How much development time was lost to caution and stubbornness? The film didn't lie. Sanders wasn't perfect, but he didn't need to be. He was progressing, exactly the way Musgrave said he would. And with every confident throw, the narrative that he wasn't ready started to unravel in real time. That's when the situation crossed a line. This was no longer a hypothetical debate about potential. It was tangible proof that the system had held him back. And once that realization settled in, it became clear this wasn't going to end quietly, especially with what Musgrave hinted at next. The most telling part of Musgrave's message didn't come wrapped in criticism. It came wrapped in a warning. One short phrase that carried far more weight than it seemed to at first. "We'll get to the crux of the matter in the offseason." That wasn't coach speak. That wasn't a throwaway line meant to end a press conference. That was someone signaling that unresolved issues were about to be addressed, internally and directly. In NFL terms, that's the calm before uncomfortable conversations. Musgrave wasn't talking about routine film sessions or minor tweaks. He was talking about accountability, about decisions that shaped an entire season, about why a quarterback showing clear progress had to wait so long for a real opportunity. And by choosing that language, he made it clear this wasn't going to be brushed aside once the season ended. That phrase also exposed just how deep the disagreement runs. You don't talk about the crux unless there's a core problem, something structural, something that affects more than one player. Musgrave was pointing straight at the foundation of how the Browns evaluate and develop quarterbacks and suggesting it needs to be re-examined. The timing mattered too. Saying it now, while Sanders is actively proving himself, removes any plausible deniability. It forces the organization to explain past decisions instead of hiding behind future plans. It puts pressure on leadership to justify why patience suddenly appeared only after opportunities were already lost. And that's why this moment feels different. The Browns can't spin this as normal growing pains or internal alignment issues anymore. One of their own coaches flagged a problem and promised it would be addressed. That opens the door to reviews, to tough meetings, to questions no one wants to answer. Because once you say crux of the matter, you're admitting something fundamental went wrong. And whether the Browns confront that honestly or try to dodge it will say everything about what comes next, not just for Shedeur Sanders, but for every young quarterback who follows. By the time everything settles, this story won't be remembered as just a disagreement over a rookie quarterback. It's bigger than Shedeur Sanders. It's about what kind of organization the Browns actually are when no one's watching. Sanders has become a mirror, a test of whether this franchise has learned anything from its past, or whether it's still trapped in the same cycle: cautious leadership, fractured development, and talent forced to fight the system instead of being supported by it. His situation didn't expose a lack of ability, it exposed a lack of alignment. What makes this moment so uncomfortable is that the proof is already there. Sanders didn't crumble when he finally got his chance. He responded. He adapted. He showed the exact traits teams claim they're looking for in a young quarterback. And he did it after months of being sidelined, doubted, and quietly dismissed. That's why Musgrave's words mattered. He wasn't just defending a player, he was defending a principle that development requires trust, patience, and real opportunity, that rookies aren't finished products, that growth doesn't happen in hiding. And when an organization forgets that, it doesn't just hurt one player, it poisons the culture. Now the Browns are at a crossroads. They can acknowledge what this season revealed and change how they develop talent, or they can protect the same structures that nearly wasted a year of growth for a quarterback who's still proving he belongs. One path builds something sustainable, the other repeats history. The good news is Sanders is still standing, still working, still showing that he's capable of leading at this level. The bad news is he's had to do it in spite of the system, not because of it. And if Cleveland doesn't address the deeper issues Musgrave quietly dragged into the light, this won't be the last time a promising quarterback gets caught in the middle. Because in the end, this was never just about one player waiting his turn. It was about whether the Browns are ready to stop getting in their own way.